As we heed the call of land justice, may we be attentive to the roots of injustice so that we can better imagine just land futures. So thank you for being here. And Eric, I'll invite you to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'd like to introduce Sister Priscilla Solomon, CSJ, who is an Ojibway Anishinabek who works in the Faith and Justice Office of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Sault Ste. Marie. Her primary ministry is working on reconciliation and ecological justice within her congregation and in collaboration with others. Her work has focused most recently on reconciliation between Indigenous people and people of settler origins. She holds a master's degree in pastoral counseling from Loyola University in Chicago. In 2011, she received an honorary Doctor of Letters from Nipissing University for her involvement in justice work. Welcome, Priscilla. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. Bonjour. Good afternoon. Priscilla Indishnikas, Makwan Dodem, Ogimakwe Indukuk. Good afternoon. My given name is Priscilla, and as Eric said, I'm Ojibway and a sister of St. Joseph. Ojibway people belong to our father's clan, so both Eva and I are Makwa, the Bear Clan, and I also acknowledge our mother's clan, Wawashkesh, the Deer Clan. My spirit name is Ogimakwe, and I am from the Henry Inlet First Nation, and I now live in North Bay, Ontario. North Bay is situated in the traditional territory of the Nipissing Anishinabek people, and it's part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. I'm grateful to the Nipissing Anishinabek who have cared for and protected this land in the past and the present, and for future generations. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you today, and hopefully what I share will be helpful to you. The topics are quite complex. However, as I begin, I recall words that my dad often spoke, and he would say, life in all its complexity is basically very simple. I hope that as I try to address some of the complexity, I can communicate a very simple and basic message. That is, incredible injustices have been done to Indigenous peoples for centuries on this land. Today, we are faced with the opportunity to acknowledge some of those wrongs and to consider ways we might collaborate to rectify them, specifically in relation to the land. And I am aware that this is Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are being considered in this entire program. But it was the Indigenous people who first lived on this land that I would like to speak about in relation to the topic of, that I've been given for today. The title for this session is The Unjust Roots of the Private Land and Real Estate System. The topics that I was invited to consider are the doctrine of discovery and the Catholic Church, colonization, racism, and dispossession. These are the unjust roots. They're like a tangled web in which every root is entangled with every other root. If you pull on one, it pulls on another. So how do we disentangle them so we can better understand them? In addition to these issues and counterbalancing them in some way are Indigenous resistance, survival, and resurgence. Regretfully, the time isn't long enough for me to be able to say much about those, but since the so-called discovery, Indigenous peoples have resisted and survived. We are now reclaiming what was taken from us, our languages, teachings, values, spiritualities, and ceremonies, and our rights to the land and its richness, its beauty, and its life-giving energies. That is resurgence. Indigenous people are experiencing a resurgence. They were once free, self-determining peoples on Turtle Island. Prior to first contact, Indigenous peoples lived in interdependent and respectful relationships with the land. Respect, reciprocity, and care for the land were, and are in most cases, still very strong values for Indigenous peoples. The relationship with the life of the land is so close that Indigenous people have said, and you heard this repeated by one of the organizers last week, we are the land is us. We Indigenous see ourselves as protectors of the land and waters, since, according to our teachings and laws, we have been given the responsibility, that very responsibility, by the Creator. Colonization began with Europeans migrating to lands outside of Europe, including to Turtle Island. I ask, what made colonization possible? Certainly the attitudes and beliefs of the settlers and of the European political and religious leaders made it possible. There are two key concepts that facilitated it. One is the doctrine of discovery, and the other is the concept of terra nullius. Both have been used to deprive Indigenous peoples of lands, rights, and freedoms. Probably the most succinct explanation of the doctrine of discovery that I have heard is this, and I quote a friend of mine. The doctrine of discovery is the rationale that European settlers used to justify taking lands from Indigenous peoples. End of quote. It includes also taking away Indigenous peoples' lives and livelihoods, rights and freedoms, languages, cultures, and spiritualities, both in the past and in the present, since that is what the land provides to us. Terra nullius, which translates as empty land, is best understood as land that the Indigenous people were not cultivating. Terra nullius is the justification that settlers used to claim and take possession of the land. That is, they believed that because it was not being cultivated as land in Europe was, it was therefore empty and free for the taking. Exactly what the doctrine of discovery is, and why and how it happened, and what enabled it to happen, is perceived differently by Indigenous peoples and the Roman Catholic Church. Other churches too, but I speak specifically of the Roman Catholic Church. However, those differences do not change the fact that peoples and governments of European origins took possession of and power over lands that Indigenous people had lived on, cared for, and governed for millennia. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, in discussing colonization by European empires as the basis for the residential schools, said this, and I quote, "At their height, empires laid claim to most of the earth's surface and controlled the seas. Numerous arguments were advanced to justify such extravagant interventions into the lands and lives of other peoples. These were largely elaborations on two basic concepts. One, the Christian God had given the Christian nations the right to colonize the lands they discovered as long as they converted the Indigenous populations. And two, the European nations were bringing the benefits of civilization to the heathen. In short, it was being contended that people were being colonized for their own benefit, either in this world or in the next." End of quote. The thinking and the beliefs that underlie these concepts, along with the sense of racial superiority that the Europeans had, are the main roots of the unjust processes of colonization and of the systems in which we live today. There are varying positions and understandings of where the doctrine of discovery is rooted and whether or not it has been abrogated or repudiated. Some of the various very articulate Indigenous leaders who speak about the doctrine of discovery are Oren Lyons, Stephen Newcomb, and Mark Charles. For them, 3 papal bulls issued between 1452 and 1493 are the doctrine of discovery. They base this on their understanding of the 3rd bull, Inter Caetera, in which Pope Alexander the Sixth, granted to Spain all lands discovered west of a meridian 100 leagues west of the Azores and between the poles, provided they were not already in the possession of any Christian ruler. From a Catholic perspective, the doctrine of discovery has been repudiated and the 3 papal bulls have been made null and void. In Canada in 2016, 5 Canadian Catholic organizations gave a joint response to the Truth and Reconciliation Call to Action number 49. It called for all religious denominations and faiths to repudiate the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. The Catholic response is titled, A Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius, a Catholic Response. It's available on the Canadian Catholic Conference of Bishops website, and Eric has the links to this and to other material that I've sent to him. In April of 2010, the papal delegate of the Observer Mission of the Holy See to the UN, in a statement to the Permanent Council on Indigenous Peoples, stated very clearly that the Church has rejected Inter Caetera. He said, and I quote, I hope the following becomes clear. 1. The Holy See confirms that Inter Caetera has already been abrogated and considers it without any legal or doctrinal value. 2. The Holy See, in accordance with Catholic social teaching, is consistently paying particular attention to the relationship of Indigenous peoples to their lands and resources. 3. The Holy See, as demonstrated also by our support for the recent Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, will continue to be an outspoken moral voice in support of the dignity and rights of Indigenous peoples. End of quote. And I think that the Synod on the Amazon witnesses to response of support by the Church for Indigenous peoples' relationships to their lands and the life of land. In the age of so-called discovery, there were early missionaries, including Bartolome de las Casas, who witnessed the destructive, dehumanizing attitudes of colonizers and spoke out against them. In response to their concerns, Pope Paul III in 1537 issued the bull Sublimus Deus. In it, he stated, and again I quote, we consider, however, that the Indians are truly men and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but according to our information, they desire exceedingly to receive it. We define and declare that the said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or their possession, dominio, of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, and that they may and should freely and legitimately enjoy their liberty and the possession of their property. Nor should they in any way be enslaved. Should the contrary happen, it shall be null and have no effect. End of quote. The Church holds this position today and sees this as a repudiation and abrogation of the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. While religious and political thinking and beliefs as an underlying principle can be found in the European context of the time, they were put into law in 1823 by a decision of the Supreme Court of the US. Because the ruling often referred to rights that came by virtue of discovery, it became a legal doctrine of discovery. That ruling is still in effect, and it continues to deprive Indigenous peoples of their rights and lands, as do the effects of the papal bull, despite their repudiation. However, this brief reflection indicates some of the complexity. Hopefully, I do hope that the brief reflection indicates some of the complexity of what underlies the destructive colonization process, and it gives a sense of the urgency of decolonization and the need for some form of restitution. Let me now say a little about colonization, which has its roots in the context of the European empire building and in racism. It is dehumanizing and destructive process. It went beyond the theft of land and resources to the efforts to destroy and eliminate Indigenous peoples. Genocide. Yet we are still here. Arthur Manuel, Sequemic elder and activist, spoke of three elements or dynamics in the process of colonization. Although he was speaking of Canada, I believe the dynamics apply to the process in the US too. He said, and I quote, "It began with our dispossession. Our lands were stolen out from underneath us. The next step in the colonization process was to ensure that we were made dependent on the interlopers so they could control every aspect of our lives. They had to strip us of our ability to provide for ourselves. This was done by cutting us off from access to our land. This massive land dispossession and resultant dependency is not only a humiliation and an instant impoverishment, it has devastated our social, political, economic, cultural, and spiritual lives. The final element in the triad of colonialism is oppression. Indigenous people who try to defend their land are met with swift repression, and land defenders are overwhelmed by military or paramilitary forces and carried off to jail." End of quote. And that's a current reality, not just in the past. Statistics in both Canada and the US give some indication of the nearly total dispossession of the land of Indigenous peoples. This is a quote. As of 2017, only 0.36% of Canada's land mass has currently been set aside as reserve status. End of quote. In addition to most of our traditional lands, which are larger than the reserve lands, most of these lands are designated Crown lands and are under the control of the Canadian governments. The federal and provincial governments claim them and whatever resources are in them, and they make these resources accessible to extractive industries with little or no benefit to the Indigenous peoples. We know that all the land designated as Indigenous reserves in Canada combined into one would be less than the size of the Navajo reservation in the US. Yet in the States, the total area or land mass of all of the reservations, including the Navajo land, is 2.3% of the US. A backgrounder on lands, territories, and resources from the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Rights says, and I quote, "Despite positive decisions in courts and human rights bodies for land and resource rights of Indigenous peoples, issues of dispossession of land and resources, forced removal or relocation, denial of land rights, and accompanying violence are a reality for Indigenous communities around the world. Human rights defenders protecting their rights in their lands, territories, and resources are often victims of violence. My heart goes out to the people of the Ukraine who are currently living through a horror that has the three dynamics of colonization: dispossession, dependency, and oppression. The third main root of the injustice is systemic racism. The sense of superiority that enabled Europeans to assume that they had a God-given right to the lands and resources of other peoples is racist. It denies the equality of human beings, and it enables violence against people of colors, other colors of the human race. I need to remind you of the very public acts of systemic racism against Black people that have shaken the US in the past few years. And it's shaken us too, and it's happened here in Canada. One aspect of systemic racism that remains somewhat hidden, perhaps even unconscious, is the racism that exists against Indigenous peoples, who for the most part remain invisible in the US. That very invisibility is racist. It denies the existence and lived reality of people whose ancestors were driven off their lands or forced to survive without the very things that once sustained them. Racism enables land dispossession, and it enables destructive human interactions. For people of white origins, it finds expression in a sense of racial superiority, in a sense of white privilege, and ultimately in white supremacy. I know that some religious communities have begun to look at their own attitudes and to identify and root out racism and its sense of white privilege, both personal and systemic. I see that particular action as one of the tasks before us, whether religious or secular. It requires that we examine any of the stereotypes we have of the other, in this case of Indigenous peoples. When we identify the stereotypes and begin to challenge them, we can begin to build relationships on the basis of real people and real lives being lived among us and around us. A second task that follows on becoming anti-racist is the task of developing real, positive, and personal and communal relationships with real Indigenous people. And the three presenters in the last session who spoke about the Kelp Farm Initiative really witnessed to us the importance of developing such relationships. And finally, I want to express a caution. The words and realities that I have been speaking about today have the capacity to create feelings of guilt and shame, as we were reminded earlier. Guilt for the actions of the people in the age of discovery belongs to them, and we leave it to our compassionate God to judge. However, people today may certainly feel shame for their ancestors' actions in the colonization process. Those of us who are Catholic may also feel shame over the three papal bulls and their results. We are not guilty for our ancestors' decisions and actions, but we are responsible for our own. My caution comes out of my experience of the process of colonization and the trust issues that arise, and from a concern that we are dealing with issues that can create feelings of guilt and shame. Even the very title, The Unjust Roots of Private Property and Real Estate, can trigger these feelings for religious who hold property in common. My caution is this: be aware of feelings of shame and guilt in considering proposals for the disposal of your properties regardless of who or what is causing those feelings to arise. Shame and presumed guilt are not an appropriate basis for action. Two things are required. One, a clear and prayerful discernment of where God and how God is calling you to act. And two, developing positive, non-racist, and significant relationships with Indigenous peoples. That may well lead to a decision to find a way to return land to Indigenous peoples or to share it more effectively. If it does, it will be a decision that comes out of a sense of shared responsibility for the land and its people, not from a sense of guilt or shame. Miigwech, thank you.
Miigwech, Priscilla,
welcome.
thank you so much. A huge honor to have you with us today and sharing